Hello students, today we are going to discuss about the government's policy towards unemployment. The government's policy will also dictate its strategy to solve this problem. As you know, we have a huge army of unemployed people, and therefore the government also recognized this problem, and they have been making some efforts towards this. But right in the beginning, during the second plan, it was realized that we should have small scale industries, because whenever you want to develop a country, industrialization is said to be, or it is taken to be, synonymous to development. So it is felt that any country cannot have development without industrialization. And if you want to go for industrialization, then there are two paths that you can follow. The one is that we select a path which encourages small scale industries. So in small scale industries, investment is low. We know that in our country we have shortage of capital. Capital is scarce in underdeveloped countries, and so if you take up small scale industries, investments will be very low, and employment also on the other hand will be very high. Comparatively, it will be larger than the large scale industries. So if you take up small scale industries as a method of progressing in the economy, maybe the problem of unemployment would have been solved to some extent. But this did not happen, and so the problem that we are facing today. Now, for example, the second 5-year plan 1957 to 1962, it estimated a backlog of unemployed people at 5 million, an annual addition of labor force at 1.5 to 2 million. In the second 5-year plan envisages that 5% per annum should be the rate of growth. So it targets a growth rate of 5%. It envisaged a rate of growth of 5% per annum, which was expected to generate employment opportunities for all of them over a period of 10 years, and employment thus was treated as a goal of development. There was an indirect emphasis on employment rather than having a direct emphasis on employment. However, the achievements relating to growth of employment fell short of expectations. GDP growth rate averaged around 3.5% per annum. Employment growth was only 2% per annum, whereas labor force increased at a faster rate of 2.5% per annum. And as a result, the number of unemployed increased from about 5 million to about, that was 5 million in 1956 to around 10 million in 1973-74. So this forced the planners to rethink their approach and to tackle the problem of increasing unemployment and persistent poverty, which was affecting almost 1/2 of India's population. So during the fifth 5-year plan 1974 to 79, it was envisaged that a reorientation of development strategy towards an employment-oriented growth and introduction of special anti-poverty employment programs had to be taken up. The Planning Commission acknowledged in the 6th plan document the hard reality that despite planning, employment opportunities had not adequately increased over the years. The position was not satisfactory even in terms of long-term employment. So not only in the short term, but it was felt that in the long run also the targets will not be achieved. So keeping in view these facts, the employment policy under the 6th plan aimed at two major goals of reducing unemployment for a majority of labor force and cutting down on long-term unemployment. Obviously, for a lasting solution of these problems, employment-oriented rapid economic growth was necessary. Hence, efforts in this direction were combined with short-term measures which provided some relief, at least on temporary basis. See, in our country we have chosen to be a socialistic democratic country. we have chosen some amount of capitalism also, but in this capitalism we also have two sectors, which are public sector and the private sector. So these two, we wanted also to have the cooperative sector which was coexisting with this, and therefore an attempt was made to have the cooperative sector, private sector and the public sector, and the government committed itself to a policy of employment generation in all these sectors. It was admitted that production in the public sector is highly capital intensive, and thus there was not much of scope for creation of fresh employment in this sector. So as we know, not only does it take a lots of investment in a capital intensive activity, there is a lots of investment that should be made, but the employment that can be generated in such an activity will be very low. In other words, the investment that you will have to make for generating or creating one job would be very large compared to what happens in the small scale sector. So in the small scale sector, even with a smaller investment you can create a job, but in the large scale industry very huge amounts of investments have to be made to increase employment. So the government decided to concentrate particularly on policy measures seeking to influence the private demand and utilization of manpower in the private sector. This required emphasis on self-employment ventures in agriculture, cottage and small industries and allied activities, as well as non-farm operations. Some of the major employment programs thus undertaken were the Integrated Rural Development Program, the National Rural Employment Program, the National Scheme for Training Rural Youth and Self-Employment, the Operation Flood 2 Dairy Product or Dairy Project and other dairy development schemes, and fish farming development agencies. So all these activities were given some kind of a incentive so they could grow, and because they were supposed to be generating a lot of employment. And during the late 70s and the 80s, the government recognized the fact that in Indian conditions, percolation effects of growth were not sufficient to generate the required employment opportunities. So these programs that the government started needed to be supplemented by employment programs for specific targeted groups like SCs, STs in the country, economically backward in the country. So they had to be targeted in a specific way, because initially it was thought that if rich people in the community invest, the benefit would percolate to the poorer sections of the society. But this was not happening, and therefore the government tried to concentrate on the poorer classes and help them to come up in life. So however, the magnitude of unemployment problem continued to increase. According to the 7th 5-year plan 1985-90, for the first time it sought to place employment at the center of the development strategy. The Planning Commission stated that the central element of the development strategy of the 7th plan is to generate productive employment. The 7th plan, like some other earlier plans, assigned a key role to the agricultural sector for employment generation. However, the agricultural sector cannot eliminate the entire unemployment backlog and also absorb additions of the labor force. Therefore, the programs of rural development, particularly those of rural capital formation in the form of construction, were undertaken. The planners were clear that even the realization of a higher rate of industrial growth could not absorb more than a fraction of unemployed and underemployed labor force in the organized industrial sector. So according to the Planning Commission, employment generation does not necessarily imply creation or creating of wage employment. Under the 7th plan, there was considerable emphasis on creation of conditions for additional self-employment. You can see that the emphasis is now on the rural sector, and because as we know, the amount of unemployment that you find in the rural areas more severe, or it is at a higher level than the unemployment that you find in the urban areas. This is why many of the people from the rural areas try to come to the city, to at least have some kind of a livelihood, whereas in the rural areas opportunities may be lacking. It was clear by this time that GDP growth rate increased at 5.2% during 1983 to 1993-94, and then again it increased to 6.7% from 1993-94 to 1999-2000, and the rate of employment growth actually declined from 2.7% to 1.07% per annum over the period. So, employment elasticity of GDP growth correspondingly declined from 0.52 to 0.16. This we had seen earlier over the period. The backlog of unemployment at the start of the 10th 5-year plan 2002 to 2007 was estimated at 35 million. The addition to the labor force in this plan was estimated to be 36 million. So, you can see that although there have been efforts, those efforts have not fructified. In other words, maybe the causes and the solutions did not suit or were not appropriate. The plan argued that achievement of the targeted rate of growth at 8% per annum would add 30 million. Again, the government thought that this time they were not satisfied with 5%, so they said, okay, let us have a target of 8%, and if we have 8% rate of growth, then the backlog of unemployment can be cleared. While the policies advocated for employment generation in different sectors of the economy, particularly in agriculture and allied activities such as medium enterprises, broad-based rural non-farm activities, and some of the social service sectors like education and health, an appropriate policy changes for faster development of sectors of high labor intensity like construction, tourism, communication, information technology and financial services, they thought would enable the addition of employment. Another 19.32 million jobs or person years of employment could be generated. Thus, roughly 50 million person years of employment was planned to be generated over the 10th plan period, which would bring down the backlog of unemployment from around 35 million at the beginning of the 10th plan to roughly 21 million to the end of the 10th plan. But as we know, all this also did not fructify, especially when you look at unemployment. So, unemployment problem continues to be at a staggering level. The 11th 5-year plan 2007 to 12 aimed at creating 58 million job opportunities. When we look at our plans, we feel that we have lots of plans which are on the paper, so we call them as paper plans. But when it comes to efforts, when it comes to realities, there is very less of it that is found. They thought 58 million job opportunities would be created, and some kind of a description was given that about 17 million in trade, hotel and restaurant sector, and about 12 million each in industry and construction, and no increase in employment is projected in the agricultural sector. So, this time they left the agricultural sector and did not try to guess what would happen there. The plan advocates an employment strategy that can ensure rapid growth of employment and improvement in the quality of employment. The plan argues that while self-employment will remain an important employment category in the foreseeable future, it accounted for 58% of all employed in 2004-5. So, there is a need to increase the share of regular employees in total employment, and it should be the focus of the policy to achieve a substantial increase in the share of regular employment with a matching reduction in the share of casual employment, which at present as high as 23%. So, what we find is that the world has been changing, globe has been changing. Everywhere in the world, the unemployment is not the same as it was earlier. Now, with the new technology coming in, even some of our skilled workers find it difficult to even go abroad and work, because now, for example, a worker goes to USA, he has to be paid in dollars and the scales will be higher there. So, now with the IT, and information technology and internet and such things. People don't need to go to USA. They can outsource the work to India, and people can work in India and they are paid much lower salaries compared to what they would get if they went to USA, and the job is also done. So with the new technology, there are many aspects. Now you find that in many cases there is casualization of labor. Casualization means where if he works he gets some income, if he doesn't get anything. In other words, there is no security, there is nothing like pension or any other benefit that a person would get after his retirement. Casualization of labor, you find that labor is not given the importance that it should be given. So the government's response in this context has been to aim at raising rural incomes through poverty alleviation programs. You all know that there are the NREGA programs. The main program nowadays is NREGA, which is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, where everyone is given some 100 days of employment. Every family is given 100 days of employment. We find that there is lots of leakage in these funds. The real benefiters are few, and on the other hand you find that some who have got these benefits refuse to go to other sectors in the rural sector, especially agriculture. Agriculture was unable to pay high wages to laborers, but with this situation where laborers are getting more income by just joining the NREGA scheme, are refusing to go to agriculture, and so agricultural labor has become costlier now, and it has become unsustainable. Agriculture in the rural areas has become unsustainable. People of the family themselves have to work, or they have to just stop their agricultural activities. Because of the slowdown in the economy during 2008-9, following global recession, a large number of private sector industries cut down their labor force. The public sector is doing no better. In fact, even before global financial meltdown hit the Indian shores, the central government owned companies had shed 44,000 employees in 2007-8. Now, Raj Krishna has shown that the assumption that population and productivity would continue to grow at the existing rate, the most comprehensive daily status unemployment could be eliminated in the next 2 decades if a long-term growth rate could be raised to 6.5%. Now, when Raj Krishna did his exercise, employment elasticities for all sectors were around 0.68. Since then, employment elasticity has declined. It has been estimated at 0.16 in 1993-94 to 1999-2000. Look at the magnitude of this problem. Now, if you want to have an increase in the employment to the extent of 3%, then 6-fold more, that is 18% growth rate is required in the economy. Therefore, the Indian economic growth by itself can never solve the unemployment problem, and government policy which gives overriding priority to economic growth would add to unemployment backlog rather than reduce it. So let us summarize what we have learned today. It was understood that unemployment is one of the big problems that we have in our country, and therefore it has to be addressed. So there were lots of efforts, and plans also indicated that such efforts will be made. There were lots of schemes which were there for generation of employment and also for mitigating or reducing the amount of poverty that was existing. But plan after plan, the magnitude of unemployment has been increasing, and therefore now the solution, because the government was concentrating on growth rate, and they thought if the growth rate of the economy is kept high, then maybe employment would be corrected. But according to the estimates that are recently made, it needs a very huge amount of growth regarding the GDP of the country. So GDP of the country growing at 18% could facilitate an increase in employment of 3%, and therefore this is considered to be something very impossible. Take down a few questions. Explain the government policy with regard to unemployment in India. Give an account of the programs that government took up to alleviate poverty and to reduce unemployment. The references for this lesson: Indian Economy by Rudar Dutt and Sundaram. The other book that you could follow, Indian Economy by Mishra and Puri.